Friday. Let me hit record. So we'll see how we do today and see how we do Friday. And we might have to shift everything by like a day, which is fine. We've got extra time in there. We can build stuff in and see where we go from there. So let me share my screen.
Nice little break though from everything that was due Friday. Thank you for
Here you go.
that.
So here we are, exam. So this week we're supposed to go over the muscular system and do the muscle identification. But we're still kind of stuck here on some of the lab 5 stuff or the bone stuff, right? And so everything might get pushed by a little bit of time, and I'll just make sure to keep you guys updated on that. All right, so let's go to the PowerPoint. All right, so we left off talking about things like osteopenia and osteoporosis, right? And how osteoclasts can lead to those conditions by degrading the bones.
Mm-hmm.
The rest of this chapter is all about naming the bones and the bone markings and that sort of stuff, the features of the bones. So not only do you need to know the names of the bones, but you need to know some of the markings and some of the features, right? There are some things that are just very definite on the bones that you need to know. This is one of the big areas where this class differs from the people that have the 2-semester A&P, right? When I teach the 2-semester A&P, they need to know kind of all of the markings, the processes, the elevations, that kind of thing. Whereas your class will need to know the names of the bones and a few of the markings. So just in general, some of the markings are called processes, elevations, projections, condyles, epicondyles. They're places where the bones kind of stick out. And the reason for that is for tendons and muscles to attach, okay, and ligaments to attach. And then there are also depressions, grooves in the bones. And those a lot of times are where blood vessels and nerves are going to pass. Openings, we'll see that there are some openings for blood vessels to pass through and for nerves to pass through. So when we get to the actual skeletal system, right, the adult skeleton consists of 206 bones. Are we born with that many? Are we born with more? Are we born with less? What do you think?
Born with more, and they
Born
fuse
with
I
more.
together.
think we're born with more, yeah.
Good. What happens as we age?
They
kind of
fuse together.
They fuse
Together.
together. Good. So what you'll start to see when we're going through all these different systems of the body is that just to make it a little simpler to study, we divide the systems, right? We make the system, we kind of put it into these compartments. And for the skeletal system, we divide it into axial and appendicular. Axial comes from the word axis. So if I were to ask you, what's the axis of our body? Where is the axis of our body? What do you think?
Do you want the axial, like skeleton, like the skull and the rib and the spinal cord?
Right. Well, I'm just trying to think of what the axis of our body is, right? The axis is the center of our body.
Center.
Just like if you think about like the axle on a wheel, right, on a car. So the axis is the center of our body. So all the bones that are along the center line, the skull, the rib cage, the spinal column, right, the vertebrae, those are all part of the axial skeleton. Appendicular, the word appendicular comes from the same word as appendage. So the appendicular skeleton is dealing with your appendages, your arms and your legs, and what holds the arms and the legs onto the rest of the body. So in this diagram, on the left are all the bones of the axial skeleton. They're shown in yellow and labeled. And on the right are the appendicular bones. They're shown in white and labeled in white. So the axis, we'll start with the axial skeleton. It forms the axis of the body, everything along the center. It consists of 80 bones, which are found in the skull You've got bones in the ear and the hyoid. You've got bones of the thoracic cage and bones of the vertebral column. So first off, your skull. Your skull is actually 22 bones. Okay, it's not just one big bone. It's 22 bones that are fused together. There are 8 cranial and 14 facial bones. We'll talk about those. And then there are bones associated with the skull. There are 6 ear bones. You have 3 in each ear. And they are tiny. They're about the size of a grain of rice. And what they do is they pick up the vibrations in the air and they transmit those to cells in your inner ear. And those bones count as part of the axial skeleton. So there's 6 bones right there. Then there's a bone called the hyoid bone. Anybody ever heard of that or know where the hyoid bone is?
I
Heard
just
of it,
looked
but my
it up.
mind's drawing blank for some reason.
Oh, where did I? Somewhere in here.
Somewhere in there, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
the hyoid bone is the only bone that's not attached to another bone. It's
it.
in your neck, okay, kind of right about just above where your Adam's apple is, and it attaches to a lot of muscles and ligaments and tendons. The significance of it, a lot of times, if you listen to any true crime stuff or you watch any true crime stuff, if they find a body and the hyoid bone has been broken, they assume the person has been strangled, right? Because it's this bone in here in your neck. It's kind of is right in front of, it's like a U-shaped bone that goes right in front of your trachea.
Yeah, they're showing like we're under here.
Yep, exactly. So there's that. Then there are bones of the thoracic cage. Well, that's your rib cage, right? We'll see that there are 25 of those. There's 24 ribs, and then your sternum. And then the bones of your vertebral column. Well, you have 24 vertebrae, and then you have the sacrum and the coccyx. We'll talk about those. So, functions of the axial skeleton: support and protect, right? This is protecting your brain. Your vertebrae are protecting your spinal cord. Your rib cage is protecting your heart and your lungs, right? They also provide a place for the attachment of muscles so that you can move your head and your neck, and muscles so that you can move your chest, you can breathe, right? This helps to stabilize your appendages. We're not talking about actually attaching any of the appendages to the body, but it does stabilize them. So this, again, your skull houses your brain and your sensory organs. And here is a picture of the adult skull. And it's a nice colored picture so that you can see a lot of the bones in the skull. Sorry, I'm just gonna go back to this then. So we've got all these bones that are colored in, right? There's the anterior view, and then here is your inferior view, looking at it from below. And then here's looking down on the skull from above. So I'm going to skip through these right now and go through some of the wording first, and then we'll come back to some of the diagrams. So of the skull are divided into facial bones and cranial bones. And what do you think of the difference between facial bones and cranial bones? What do you think is the difference between what they do?
I'm trying to think. I am drawing a blank for a minute.
They perform different functions.
Right, such as?
Digestive muscles and protect the brain. And
so cranial bones actually protect the brain. They surround and protect the brain. They're the bones that actually are surrounding your brain. Your facial bones are on the front of your face, obviously. Those are mostly for muscles and nerves to attach. So you're thinking about moving, moving muscles to provide facial expressions, or some of our sensory organs like our eyes and our ear, those are relying on facial bones. What I'm realizing I don't have in this particular PowerPoint is the cranial bones spelled out. So here are the cranial bones. There are 8 of them. The first one to name is the frontal bone. Frontal bone's right here, tan bone. It is your forehead. Okay, it's one bone, it goes all the way across. Behind that, you have 2 parietal bones. Okay, so if I'm looking at the skull from above, there are 2. They are divided right down the middle, and there's a right parietal and a left parietal bone. On the sides of the head, you have this temporal bone, which is kind of this pink color, right? That's where your temples are. You have a right and a left temporal bone. So that's frontal, 2 parietal, 2 temporal. We're up to 5. On the back of your head is something called the occipital bone. You can see it here from the bottom. It's this big yellow bone. It just goes all the way across, kind of like the frontal bone. We don't have a right and a left. So we've got an occipital bone. Now, the other 2 cranial bones are really hard to see in a picture. They're really hard to see because they're holding your brain and your facial bones are in front of them, right? So they're kind of behind your eyes, behind your nose. They're holding the bottom of your brain. They are the ethmoid bone, which is this green one here, okay, and the sphenoid bone, which is this purple one over here. Now, you can see the sphenoid bone behind the eye sockets, right? All of these facial bones are in front of it. It's holding your brain. It's holding your brain in place, and then all the facial bones are in front of it. Your ethmoid bone, you can barely see on the inside of the eye socket. Okay, but part of it comes down into your nasal cavity, right? If you look way back behind the nose, that's part of your ethmoid bone. So it's, again, it's holding your brain in place. It's keeping your brain protected. Now, if we look from the bottom, the sphenoid bone becomes much easier to see. It's this big bat-shaped purple bone. Okay. And if we go to the next slide, which shows the skull from above with the top cut off, right? So this would be if you cut off the top of the skull and you're looking down through it, you can see the sphenoid bone. Again, it's still purple. It looks like a bat, right? And you can see the ethmoid bone in front of it. The ethmoid bone, think of it kind of like a blade pointing straight down, right? So it's pointing straight down. You're just seeing the top of it. Remember that this goes all the way down behind your nose, behind your nasal cavity. So you can see kind of on this picture, on this particular picture, those bones are cradling your brain, right? They're supporting your brain. And actually, this region that's circled, this region of the sphenoid bone called the sella turcica, is where your pituitary gland sits. So your pituitary gland hangs down off your brain. It sits right there, that little hollowed out cavity. Okay, and if we look at the ethmoid bone, there are these things on either side called cribriform plates, which have a bunch of holes in them. And those holes allow for nerves from your nose to pass through this bone to enter your brain. So the nerves that are in your nose that are picking up odors, right, are passing through this ethmoid bone to get to your brain so that they can send information on what you smell to your brain. So again, 8 cranial bones, 1 frontal, 2 parietal, 2 temporal, 1 occipital, 1 sphenoid, 1 ethmoid. There's 8 of them. Then we get to bones of the face. Bones of the face are much more for muscle attachment, for facial expression, right? Some of them obviously where the digestive tract starts and the respiratory tract starts. Some of them provide for certain sensory information. Only one is movable. The mandible is the only one that's movable. We have maxillary bones. Where's your maxilla? A lot of people know where that is. Where do you think your maxillary bones are? Yeah. Yeah, Josh is pointing to the right place. They're the top of your jaw, at the top bones of your jaw. There are two. There's a right and a left. So there's a split down the middle. There's a right and a left. They form the top of your jaw. They also form a large part of the roof of your mouth is made up of that maxillary bone, the same bone, right? So it's the anterior roof of your mouth. That's called your palate, right? That's made up mostly of maxillary bone. The key bone markings that you need to know, there are these empty sinuses or these hollowed out sinuses, and they produce the mucus that drains into the nasal cavities. And the sinuses just kind of make the bones lighter, right? These are big bones that you're talking about. And then infraorbital foramen. Anytime you see this word foramen, it's a hole. It means a hole. So the infraorbital foramen, where do you think that hole is? Where's infraorbital? So is infra, do you think infra is going to be above or below?
It's above.
Below. Yeah, go
Below,
ahead.
right? And orbital, what's orbital?
Like your cheekbones, maybe?
Well, orbital would be your eye, right?
The eye area.
So
Okay.
infraorbital foramen would be underneath
This
your
isn't
eye
right.
sockets.
Okay, I gotcha. I'm looking at a side view.
Those are part of the maxillary bone. Those holes travel through your maxillary bones. We also have palatine bones. So the roof of the mouth, most of the roof of your mouth is made of maxillary bones. As you move backwards, right, as you move backwards with your tongue, the rear part of it, the posterior surface of it, is made of these palatine bones, right? Palatine, making up the palate. We do have a right and a left palatine bone. We have, in the nasal cavity, we have a bone called the vomer. This supports the forming part of the nasal septum. So your nasal septum is out here, right? That's cartilage. But way back in your head, in your skull, there's a bone that divides your nasal cavity into left and right. That's called the vomer. The zygomatic bones. It's a zygomatic bone.
That would be right here.
Yep, that's your cheekbone.
Yeah,
It connects up to the temporal bone. There's
yeah.
like a process that connects to the temporal bone. And so the zygomatic bones are your cheek. You have right and left cheekbones. What about the nasal bones? Where are the nasal bones?
Is that the bridge right here?
The bridge of your nose. Good, Kristen. Right at the top of your nose. So most of your nose is cartilage, but the bridge at the very
Wait,
top
the bridge.
is bone. There are right and left nasal bones, as small as they are. Then we have lacrimal bones. You know where the word lacrimal comes from? It comes from the word to cry. So lacrimal bones are on the inside of your eye socket, right? The inner surface of your eye socket. And they have a tiny little opening that the tear duct goes through. And then we have these bones called the inferior nasal conchae. They stick out from the lateral walls of your nasal cavity. So they stick into your lateral nasal cavity, and they're kind of scroll shaped, right? They're kind of like the way you would shape a scroll. what happens as we inhale air, it goes past those bones and it starts moving. And that movement of the air warms the air, warms it and moistens it. And that allows us to better take oxygen from it. It also can move the airflow towards our smell receptors, right, in our nose. The mandible is the lower jaw, right? That's the only one that moves. It articulates with the temporal bone, right? It meets up with the temporal bones. Articulation is just where two bones meet. And if you've ever heard of somebody having TMJ, right? The T stands for temporal, the M is mandible, and J is joint. So they have an issue with their temporal mandible joint, right? Their jaw clicks and they open and shut it because there's an issue with those two joints, with those two bones lining up.
And my grandma had that and she was constantly complaining. She's like, oh, it won't stop. And she kept going to the dentist and yeah.
Yep. Yeah, it's supposed to be a pain, a real pain in the butt.
What is
So
at this? Go ahead. I'm sorry.
no, go ahead. I was
I was just
show you
going to
some of
ask,
those
what
ones.
is this mental foramen for? I
So
know we
that's a good.
probably don't need to know it. I see it on the diagram.
Yep, that's a good point. So the mental foramen goes through your. The foramen. Anytime you see foramen, it's a hole. It goes through
Mhm.
your mandible, and it allows for the passage of a nerve. Now, did you ever hear somebody say, if you're watching boxing, somebody say, "Oh, they got hit on the button," right?
Yeah.
Sometimes a
Yeah.
boxer will get hit right there, and it'll knock them out. It's because you're hitting that nerve. That nerve, that nerve is so sensitive that when it gets hit, when it gets kind of shocked and overwhelms things like the heart, and it'll stop the heart from beating for a second or a split second and knock somebody out.
Ooh, that's
Good to
dangerous.
know.
That's
Yeah.
really dangerous.
So that's the button that they're talking about.
That's the button.
That's the button.
Mhm.
So on here, you can see where a lot of these bones are, right? You can see, for instance, the nasal bones are these purple ones. You can see the inferior nasal conchae are these squirrel-shaped bones on the inside of the nose. This thing right in the middle of the nose, that's where the vomer is, right? You can see it's kind of purple here. The mandible is the lower jaw. The maxilla is the orange, it's the upper jaw. Zygomatic bones are blue in this diagram. Those are the cheekbones. Lacrimal bones, that's where your tear duct goes through. Those are right on the inside of the eye socket, right? Palatine bone they're showing you here, which is weird, but it's the roof of the mouth. It's the back part of the roof of the mouth. So you'll see it better on this picture. So most of the roof of your mouth is maxilla, it's orange. But as you make your way further back, it actually is a different bone called the palatine bone, right? You can still see your zygomatic cheekbone sticking out. You can see the vomer a little bit better, how it goes right down the middle. You can see the occipital bone, right? The temporal bones. And so again, I told you foramen means hole or opening. So the foramen magnum just means big, right? So that's the big opening. What do you think passes through that foramen magnum?
Kristen knows.
What is it?
Huh?
Underneath. What do you think
Like
passes through?
the spinal?
Yeah,
like
the
the-
spinal cord. The
Now, I had
spinal
a
cord
question.
comes up through there and connects to your brain.
A quick question. I mean, would an animal skull kind of have all the same? Would like,
A mammal would. Yep.
because I was just,
Absolutely.
because I was kind of looking at some of the stuff there and I have a bear skull. So I was kind of trying to like look a little bit,
Yep.
get an idea, because obviously I can't have a human skull. So
You
I was
can.
just looking like right here.
Oh, that's
Yep.
cool.
Yeah. So
And
think
then-
about most
Kinda-
animals. So humans,
Like-
their foramen magnum is underneath, right? Think about the way we stand,
Yeah,
about our posture. most animals are on all fours. So their
Yeah.
foramen magnum is going to be kind of at the back of their skull, going in,
Yeah.
going in through the back rather than up through the bottom.
Ours would be kind of, so.
Yeah.
I was just trying to kind of get
Absolutely.
a visual picture
Yep,
when you're going through it, because obviously I don't have a human skull, but I had a bear skull, so it's kind of trying to visualize the areas.
right,
So
absolutely. Cool.
if you were talking about the nose, how it's divided in a bear skull, it kind of,
Yep, yep. Yeah, so they have all the same features, and you can see that they're just shaped a little bit differently for what that
Yeah.
animal needs, right?
so when you were kind
how
of
that
going
animal
through
behaves.
each one, I was kind of looking at the skull to try to get a visual placement of each one.
Good. And there are some really good 3D drawings. It's, nothing is the same, obviously, as actually using a skull, whether it's a model
Yeah.
or a real skull, but there are some really good 3D drawings. Okay. So then we get to the hyoid bone, right? The hyoid bone is part of the axial skeleton. It's a small U-shaped bone. You can see where it is here in this guy's neck, right? This cartilage right here is where your voice box is. So your Adam's apple. So just above that, right? It's not attached to any other bones. It's only attached to soft tissue, like muscles and tendons. It's the base for muscles associated with the larynx, the tongue, and the throat. So a lot of the muscles that go to your voice box are attached here. Also, your tongue is attached here. Your tongue, which is way up here, is attached way down there above your voice box. And it supports and stabilizes the larynx, right? It just makes it more stable, gives it support. And then we get to the vertebral column, right? The vertebral column is 26 bones. There are 24 vertebrae. There's one bone called the sacrum. And then there's one bone called the